But today's Shia, we want to focus on a comment. It's only 6 words in the Kesef Mishnah, who's the great commentary on the Rambam, and try to reconcile the Kesef Mishnah with a Gemara that seems to say the exact opposite. A Gemara Masechta Kiddushin Chavtes Amud Beis. The Rambam writes in Perek Aleph Halacha Zayin of Hilchas Talmud Torah that the chiyuv of the father vis-a-vis his son, the language of the Rambam is Ad sheyikra Torah shevichsav kula. And you may recall that last shir we discussed Torah shevichsav and whether it includes Nevi'im and Ksuvim, and perhaps there's a special status to Chamisha Chumshei Torah that doesn't apply to Nevi'im and Ksuvim. We weren't sure about that. We thought it was maybe a machlokes between Rashi and the Rambam. But be that as it may, that was last week. This week, we want to focus on a few words in the Kesef Mishnah. And the Kesef Mishnah writes, Mashma li. Now, those 2 words as an introduction give away a secret here that the Kesef Mishnah is not sure about this, meaning he doesn't have an explicit justification for this conclusion. But it seems to me, he says, that mikan v'elech, meaning beyond Torah shebechsav, eno chayav lelamdo, a father is not obligated to teach his son afilu bechinam, meaning even in a one-on-one learning session where the father doesn't have to pay a penny, nevertheless, the father is exempt, presumably because v'limaditem osam es benechem, that obligates the father, applies only to Torah shebechsav and not to Torah shebal peh. Now, the question that we want to ask here is, the Rambam writes that with regard to Torah shebal peh, the Rambam is outspoken about the fact that every single chacham is obligated to teach the Talmidim Torah shebal peh, meaning a Rebbe who's teaching Torah shebal peh to his Talmidim, that's not optional, that's not something that's voluntary, it's obligatory. And presumably, the father is no different than any other Rebbe on the face of the earth. And if every Rebbe has to teach all the Talmidim, then the father would have to teach all the Talmidim. And included in the Talmidim is his son. His son is also a Talmud who wants to be taught Torah shebal peh. And once the Rambam derives from V'shinantom levanecha that a Rebbe has to teach Torah shebal peh to the Talmidim, then the father, by virtue of V'shinantom levanecha, would have to teach his son Torah shebal peh. So that even if I grant the Kesef Mishnah's premise that v'limaditem osam es benechem does not obligate the father to teach his son Torah shebechsav, and it's limited to Torah shebech. Does not obligate the father to teach his son Torah shebal peh, and the father's obligation is limited to Torah shebechsav. But nevertheless, the father, as part of all possible Jewish scholars or chachamim, has to pass on Torah shebal peh to his talmidim. And why would his son be any different than any other Talmud? So for sure not. So at the end of the day, it would seem that the Kesef Mishnah's comment is totally theoretical. It's hypothetical. It doesn't have any real substance to it, because for sure you have to teach your son Torah shebal peh. You have to teach anybody's son Torah shebal peh. And your son is not worse than anybody else's son. So what are you telling me, that you don't have to teach your son Torah shebal peh? That doesn't make any sense. For sure you have to teach your son Torah shebal peh. You have to teach anybody's child Torah Sheba'al Peh. So what, your son is worse than anybody else's son? That can't be. But the answer, I believe, is that the chiyuv of a shinantam levanecha to teach Torah Sheba'al Peh to Talmidim is conditional on the fact that you're a chacham. The Rambam writes explicitly in Halacha Beis that chayev kol chacham v'chacham b'Yisrael alamin is kol ha-talmidim. Kol ha-talmidim afal pi she'einu b'no. The Rambam goes out of his way to describe a chacham who's obligated, therefore, to teach Torah Sheba'al Peh. But not every father is a chacham. Now, I'm not trying to imply anything negative, that the father is some sort of an ignoramus. No, I'm not saying that. But the father doesn't have the capacity and is not to be classified as a chacham who's obligated to teach the Talmidim Torah Sheba'al Peh. The father's knowledge is very limited. A chacham is someone, the Rambam says in elsewhere, not here, that you can ask him a question anywhere and he'll give you an answer. The father doesn't fit that category. If the father is a chacham, then enochinami, he has a double chiyuv. He has a chiyuv to teach his son Torah shebechsav, the written Torah, based on v'limaditem osam esvnechem. And in addition, he'll have to teach his son Torah Sheba'al Peh because of the pasuk v'shinantam levanecha. Again, all this is conditional on the fact that the father is a chacham. So basically, the father, if he's a chacham, is wearing two different hats. He's wearing the hat of a father, and he's wearing the hat of a chacham. His son generates a chiyuv on the father in Torah shebechsav as a father. His son generates a chiyuv on the father in Torah Sheba'al Peh, but not as a father, but as a chacham, whether he's a father or he's not a father. So we have here then two distinct categories and two distinct obligations. One obligation applies to every single father vis-a-vis his son, who, respectively. And that is the mitzvah of v'limaditem osam, and that only applies to Torah shebechsav. Then we have another chiyuv of an entirely different nature that's conditional and obligatory only on a chacham, and that's to teach all the Talmidim. Will it be that the father will have to teach his son Torah Sheba'al Peh? Well, that depends. If he's a chacham, then his son is no worse than any other Talmud on the face of the earth, and the father now becomes obligated. But again, that obligation is not b'toras aviv, not because it's your father, it's your son and you're the father teaching your biological son. No, has nothing to do with that. It's because you're a chacham, and a chacham has to teach all the Talmud. So again, just to summarize, this is, I think, just the aleph beis of the Rambam's first 7 halachas in Hilchos Talmud Torah. There are two distinct chiyuvim, one obligation incumbent on a father vis-a-vis his son, and that's limited to Torah shebechsav. And then you have another chiyuv, and that's the chiyuv of a chacham to teach all the Talmidim Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's the sum of what we said until now. But now, let's mention the following nafkaminas. Nafkamina number one, as we said over and over again, if the father's not a chacham, then he's not obligated to teach his son Torah Sheba'al Peh. Number two, if someone would steal this mitzvah away from his father, let's say a chacham would come along and jump into the rink and decide he's going to teach this young man Torah Sheba'al Peh. And in a sense, he's stealing that mitzvah away from the father. Now, we have a principle in halacha, Gemara Bava Kama, that if you steal a mitzvah from someone, you have to pay him asara zehuvim kesef. You have to pay him 10 gold coins. In this case, where a chacham stole the mitzvah away from the father, would the father have a claim, you stole my mitzvah, pay me asara zehuvim kesef? And the answer is no. Because that chiyuv is not incumbent on the father. It's incumbent upon every single chacham. The father happens to be a chacham, but every chacham shares that chiyuv to teach, in this case, his son Torah, and therefore the father could not claim you stole my mitzvah. This is not your mitzvah. This is a mitzvah v'shinantam that's incumbent upon every single chacham. So if somebody would come along and steal away your son and teach him Torah b'chsav, and that's your unique obligation as a father, and he stole it from you, then you have a claim and you could sue him in a Jewish court of law for asar zehuvim. But if someone teaches your son Torah Sheba'al Peh, and you yourself are a chacham, and you say to him, wait a minute, you stole my mitzvah. I wanted to teach my son Torah Sheba'al Peh, and you stole him away from me. You kidnapped him. Then you have no leg to stand on, because as a father, you're not obligated. Ella what? You're obligated as a chacham. Well, so is he. He has the same, and he shares the same exact obligation that you do. But what I want to suggest with you today is a third possible nafkamina. And that is, what happens if the father is a chacham, he can teach Torah Sheba'al Peh, and he has two candidates. One is his son, and the other is his friend's son, but he can't teach both of them. Is there a din of kedima? Meaning, does he have to give his son first dibs, first preference? And we're talking now, mind you, about Torah Sheba'al Peh. Or shall we say no? There's no din of kedima. The father, as a chacham, has no special, unique obligation to teach Torah Sheba'al Peh to his son. His obligation encompasses all the Talmidim. His son certainly qualifies to be one of those Talmidim, but the son has no greater claim than anybody else's son. They're all in the same boat. They're all made of mikshachas. They're all under the claim of vishinantam litalmidecha. And therefore, there's no reason why the son could demand kedima and say, Dad, forget about teaching him, Yenam's son, teach me, because you have a special obligation to teach me. We're talking now about Torah Sheba'al Peh. There ain't no special obligation on the father to teach his son Torah Sheba'al Peh. So?
Could you say that the relationship between the father and the son brings it that the father has more of a kedima to do it? In other words, would you say that a father wants his son to do well better than somebody else does, and in this situation, so that's why, and the concept of teaching a Torah is that for him to get the best education that he can.
Yeah, you might be right, Joe, but that's more of an emotional technicality. I don't think the father has an obligation vis-a-vis his son in the laws of Talmud Torah more than he has an obligation to teach his friend's son Torah. We're talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh, and we're talking about the mitzvah of Shinantu and incumbent on a chacham to teach all the Talmidim. You might be right; he'll have more of an emotional intensity and give more of himself to his own son. But again, I don't know that that's a factor in the laws of Talmud Torah. But here I think we might be able to introduce another possible svara. You may recall back in Halacha Dalid, I believe it was, that we mentioned a couple of months ago, Rabbi Yecheskel Sarna, the Rosh Hashiva of Hebron Yeshiva. The Rambam writes that if the father has to teach his son Torah, but he also has to learn for himself, and he can't do both, the Rambam writes, Hu kodem libno. The father has to worry and dedicate himself to his own personal Torah learning, even at the expense of his son's learning. And Rabbi Cheskel Sarna asks the question why. And he gives the following answer. We have a principle, it's a Gemara Bab Metzia, very famous, with Rabbi Kiva and Bepetura, Chayecha kodmin l'chai chavercha. And Rabbi Cheskel assumes that Chayecha kodmin l'chai chavercha sets up a din kedima, even as far as Talmud Torah is concerned. And even as far as your own son is concerned, if you have to learn Torah yourself, and if by learning Torah with your son, you're going to have to give up your Torah, which might mean a number of possibilities. It might mean because you have to hire somebody and you only have enough money to hire a Rebbe for yourself or for your son, but you can't afford a Rebbe for both. Or it might mean that if you're teaching your son personally, face-to-face, one-on-one, you want to learn that much beyond what you have to teach your son. Your son is only a young, he's 5 years old. You want to learn on a higher level. So Yechezkel Sarna says that why does the Rambam paskin hu kodem libno, that you give up your son's learning for the sake of your own learning? Because chayecha kodmin l'chai chavercha. This is an amazing chiddush because it means that chayecha kodmin is not just a halacha in Hilchas Hatzalah, who do you save first? And as Rabbi Kiva says, if you're holding on to the water, then you'll drink the water. If you're holding on to the life buoy, you'll hold on for dear life to the life buoy. And Rabbi Cheskel Sarna is saying that applies even vis-a-vis your own son. But the big chiddush of Rabbi Cheskel Sarna is that applies even to Talmud Torah. We're not talking about atzolos nefashos. We're not talking about a life situation of saving a life. We're talking about Talmud Torah. And even in Talmud Torah, Rabbi Cheskel sees that the halach of chayecha kodmin applies, and therefore who kodem libno. Why do I mention all this now? And it's just a repeat of what we had in the past. I want to know about the following. If you're choosing between yourself, the father himself, and his son, then I understand chayecha kodmin. You come before your son. But what about your son and somebody else's son? Could it be that when your decision is between your son and somebody else's son, you're covered, but your son is not covered, and your friend's son is not covered, that maybe the halach of chayecha kodmin would now expand to include your son? Meaning that in Hilchas Hatzalah, you as a father would save your son first. Because your son, as the Gemara says, Beno Kari Davua, is kind of like an extension of the body of the father. And now when we want to measure and compare your obligation as a father to your son and your obligation as a chacham to somebody else's son, perhaps you would give kedima to your son based on a chayecha kodmin kind of extension. And we're going to expand the application of chayecha kodmin to apply to your son, that he's kind of your chayecha. He's like your life. Your legacy is through your son. So the honest truth is, I don't know if there's any virtue to what I'm saying. I cannot prove it one way or the other. But therefore, I leave this out of my discussion of the nafkaminas between v'limadatem and Torah Shebechsav, and v'shinantem, the Chacham's obligation of Torah Shebal Peh. Okay. The Vilna Gaon, in a comment in his introduction to Talmud Torah, quotes a brisa called Tana Debei Eliyahu. That Eliyahu is not the Gaon, but a Tana. There's a pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi, pros lara'ev lachmecha, which means share your bread with a starving person. And Tanit Me'elio darshins that pasuk, ein ra'ev ela lidivrei Torah, that the hungry person who's suffering because he doesn't have bread to eat is symbolically a reference, an allusion to someone who doesn't have Torah. And Tanit Me'elio says, pros lara'ev lachmecha means teach Torah to somebody who needs Torah. Now, that same pasuk is the source for the mitzvah of bigud. Bigud means if you know someone who needs clothing, you have to give him clothing. If you know someone who needs shelter, you have to provide him with shelter. If you know someone who needs money and food, you have to provide him with money and food. That is the mitzvah of tzedakah. And the Tanit Be'elio, quoted by the Vilna Gaon, is applying the mitzvah of tzedakah to Talmud Torah. This is really something out of the box. Who would ever think that teaching someone Torah, in addition to being part of the mitzvah of Vishinantam, of Talmud Torah, comes under a second category of pros lara'ev lachmecha, meaning of tzedakah and chesed. And in a certain sense, it's almost like a kal vachomer. If I have to give tzedakah to someone on a physical level, that'll guarantee his place in this world, in Olam Hazeh, how much more so do I have to give tzedakah to someone that would help him guarantee a place in Olam Haba? Like the Gemara says in Elam Mitzios, we learned this in 4th grade, I remember, that if, let's say, you have two Avedos, you find someone's lost object, and you find another someone's lost object. One of them you have to return to your father, the other you have to return to your Rebbe, and who comes first? And the Mishnah says you have to give to your Rebbe first because he, through his Torah teaching, brings you to Olam Haba, whereas your father only brought you to Olam Hazeh. Again, if the father's your Rebbe, that's a whole different story. Anyway, we see clearly that Olam Haba in halacha is considered more important than Olam Hazeh, which makes sense in a certain, intuitively. I mean, Olam Haba is eternal and so forth and so on. And therefore, if we come back to pros lara'ev lachmecha, if you have to extend yourself to give tzedakah to someone to achieve physical sustenance in Olam Hazeh, then how much more so would you be obligated to give him tzedakah, and that's Torah in this context, to guarantee his place in Olam Haba? But in any event, it's explicit in the Tanit Be'elio that teaching Torah is a method of fulfilling the mitzvah of pros lara'ev, which is a mitzvah of tzedakah. Now, here we have to quote a pasuk in Mishlei, which is almost the most basic rule in any shir, in any iyun, in the laws of tzedakah. Who comes first? To whom do you give tzedakah first? And the answer is, the pasuk says, "Umibsarcha al tis'alin," and the Gemara derives from that hakarav karav kodem. So let's say you have an uncle and you have a cousin and they both need help, and you only have the wherewithal to help one of them. Your uncle comes before your cousin, etc., etc., etc. Hakarav karav kodem. So in the laws of tzedakah, if, let's say, your son would need tzedakah and your friend's son would need tzedakah, the halach of tzedakah would require you to give that limited amount of funds that you have access to your son. And if we're going to make a kal vachomer and say how much more so with regard to teaching Torah, then in the scenario that I described, where you're a chacham and you have a son who needs Torah Sheba'al Peh, and you have your friend's son who needs Torah Sheba'al Peh, perhaps there would be a din kedima, not because of chayecha kodmin l'chai chavercha, but rather because of the mitzvah of tzedakah and ubisarcha al tis'al. But I told you at the outset of the shir that today's shir is dedicated to the Kesef Mishna. The Kesef Mishna claims that there's no obligation on the father to teach his son Torah Sheba'al Peh. We added that in event that the father is a chacham, he has to teach his son Torah Shebal Peh because of the mitzvah of Shinantam Levanecha, but not because of the special, unique mitzvah that's exclusive on a father of a limanitim osam espenim. We have a Gemara in Masechta Kiddushin, and I think if we learn that Gemara, we will see, and pardon the fact that I'm using a very extreme language here, the Kesef Mishna will be mochel me, we'll see that the Kesef Mishna is wrong. Unless we can reconcile somehow the Kesef Mishna with that Gemara. So that's my subject matter for today's shir. The Gemara tells us a story about Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. He sent his son to study at the feet of Abaye. I'm going to just dramatize it. On Bein Hazmanim, his son came back from the yeshiva of Abaye, and the father started talking to him about the sugyas in the Masechta that he was learning with Abaye. And guess what? He didn't know that much. The father says to his son, Tuv at, you sit here, Rashi adds, and support the family. I'm going to learn by Abaye. And the Rambam codifies this and writes that if the son is Navon umaskil, Yosem Aviv, then who kodem libno? The Gemara's language is a little bit different, but I think the Rambam sort of extrapolated from the Gemara. The Gemara says the ben is eno mechudad shmaitata. He doesn't have a sharp awareness and control over the material that he's being taught by the shmaitata, the sugya. So again, I don't know what that means in reality about the son of Rav Acha, we'll call him Yaakov, who was named after his grandfather. What was Yaakov doing? Was he outside the Beis Medrash smoking all day? Was he playing on his laptop, on his smartphone? What was he doing? I don't know. But the bottom line is he wasn't really sharp on the material that he was studying. And in the Gemara's language, mechudad shmaitata. The word chidud means sharp, to really understand what's going on, have a real grasp on it. And shmaitata means the sugya. And when the father realized, face to face, the reality, was like cold water in his face, that his son was not mechudad shmaitata, the father said, you know what, you stay here. You support the family. I'm going to go learn by Abaye. And the Rambam, as we said before, paskins this Gemara in Hilchos Talmud Torah. Now I ask you, Rabbosai, the following question. When Rav Acha Bar Yaakov sent his son to study Torah at the feet of Abaye, what were they studying? Torah Shebechsav or Torah Shebal Peh? Take a quick vote. All in favor of Torah Shebal Peh, raise your hand. Okay, there are only a couple of people have the cameras on. Oh, good. We're up to 2. If we get one more, we have a majority. 3. Okay. 4, 5, 6. We're unanimous. There's no question about it that Abaye's yeshiva was studying Torah Shebal Peh. In fact, the word shmaitata, which the Gemara employs, refers to Torah Shebal Peh. Shmaitata means sugyas hashas. Now, I don't get it. It seems that if the son would have been up on the sugyas, if he would have been mechudad shmaitata, then for sure the father would be obligated to support the family and send off his son to Abaye. Why? According to the Kesef Mishna, the father has no obligation to teach his son Torah Shebal Peh. If he has no obligation, then what was the Havamina, or the original setup, that the father will study Torah. I'm sorry, the son will get sent to Abaye, and he'll study Torah Shebal Peh, and the father is obligated to support his son. Why? There is no chiyuv of Talmud Torah according to the Beis Yosef, according to the Kesef Mishna. I don't know. I'm not sure if anybody asks this question, but it bothers my mind tremendously. It's like an often a sugya, black on white, that the father's obligation is to teach his son Torah Shebal Peh. Again, conditional on the fact that the son is not smoking cigarettes the whole day, and he's following what's going on. If he's daydreaming and he doesn't understand the Torah, then there's no point. It's an exercise in futility, if you follow what I mean. Hopefully, when we learn Torah together, it's not futile, right? We all, again, we have to take breaks or so, and we close the camera a little bit here and there. But anyway, so that's what I don't understand here. The whole sugya is predicated on the assumption that the father has an obligation to send his son to learn Torah, but Torah Shebal Peh. That's the father's obligation. Again, it's conditional. If the son is not learning Torah Shebal Peh, if he's not producing, then forget it. But other than that, Bi'ikar Din, he has to send his son to learn Torah. Why? We're talking about Torah Shebal Peh. And the Kesef Mishna says that the father has no obligation to teach his son Torah Shebal Peh, neither b'schar to pay his tuition, and not even to teach him one-on-one, face-to-face. So the thought occurred to me that maybe the Gemara is not talking about a son. The son was just the example that the Gemara gave, but it would apply in any case, even Ben Chavero. But we're not talking about Ben Chavero here. We're talking about who has to support the family and send his son off to learn in yeshiva. That doesn't apply to Ben Chavero. So it's not coincidental that the Gemara sets this up on Bino, where there's an obligation to figure out, how you set up the family and who's going to support the family. That's all within the family unit, not Ben Chavero. So the Kesef Mishna could not argue that the Gemara is talking about Ben Chavero. It's clearly talking about Av and Ben and the special unique obligation of the father to send his son out to study Torah and support the effort by maintaining the house. But we're talking about Torah Shebal Peh. And according to Kesef Mishna, there is no such obligation on the father to teach Torah Shebal Peh. I was tempted to think that maybe the Gemara is talking about the mitzvah of tzedakah, not the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Pros la'ra'ev lachmacha, as we saw the Gaon quoting the Tana of Eliyahu, adds another dimension to the father's chiyuv, u'b'sarcha al tisalem, to supply the child with Torah so that he'll have a place in Olam Haba. And maybe what the Gemara has in mind is only the mitzvah of tzedakah. The problem is that the Rambam quotes this Gemara lahalacha in Hilchas Talmud Torah. And as we know, and I've said it to you over and over again, the Rambam is extremely sensitive and careful as to where he presents halacha and how does he classify it. And if it's in Hilchas Talmud Torah, then it's Hilchas Talmud Torah. It's not in Hilchas Tzedakah. Now, this was a tough one for me. Not to defend the Kesef Mishna against an often a Gemara. And I claim to be learning Talmud Torah, Hilchas Talmud Torah.
So sorry, Rav, you couldn't say that that's exactly the reason why he was able to take his place, because the mitzvah is not there. Otherwise, he could not have changed it.
But I'm asking you the following question, Joe. Let's say the son would have come back during his vacation period, and in a staggering way, he would answer all the questions his father would ask him. He got 101 on his exam, A plus. He knew the sugya is mechudat shmaitetam. But why was the father obligated bichlal from the get-go to send him to study Torah Shabbal Peh? It's outside the entire purview of the mitzvah Talmud Torah.
But that's not the issue of the Gemara. The issue of the Gemara is how could he have taken his place if he's got the
No,
mitzvah
but
there?
the Gemara is saying the following. There are two paragraphs in the Gemara. One paragraph is you've got to send your son to study Torah. And the second paragraph is what happens if you find out that your son, to your dismay, is not really studying the Torah. The Rambam codifies both of them. I'll read to you the Rambam. I happen to have a Rambam here on the table. The Rambam writes the following. This is Perek Aleph, Halacha Dal. Hayahu rotzel lilmod Torah. V'yesh lo ben lilmod Torah. Says the Rambam, hu kodem libno. And that's exactly what's going to happen if his son is not, is not the greatest scholar in the world, then it's hu kodem libno. So the Rambam codifies hu kodem libno. Then the Rambam writes, but im hoya ben novonu maskil, etc., yoser mimenu, then bino kodem. So there are two rules here. One rule is that if the son is not successful, or let's put it this way, he doesn't supersede his father, then the father says, I got to learn Torah. I'm going to learn Torah. You sit here and support the family. I'm not going to support you. I got to learn Torah. And off I am to the Abaye, academy. But if the son is brilliant and is superior to his father, then the Rambam says that the father has no right to say, I'm first, who kodem libno, but no, then bino kodem. And the whole discussion is about Torah Shabbal Peh. So we're trying to figure out who comes first, the father or the son, in the teaching of Torah Shabbal Peh. Well, that means, by definition, that the premise of this whole discussion and the sugya in Kiddushin is that the father has an obligation to see to it that his son is studying Torah. The exception to the rule is when he gets disappointed and he finds out that, oh no, my son doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know what's flying. But other than that, square one, the father has an obligation to send his son out to yeshiva. And that obligation is inherent in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and we're talking about Torah Shabbal Peh. How could that square with the Kesef Mishna, who says the father has no obligation to teach his son Torah Shabbal Peh? So I wanted to suggest that maybe the father's obligation in this sugya is b'toras tzedakah, but that's very difficult because we're talking about Hilchas Talmud Torah here. The Rambam codifies this in Perek Aleph Hilchas Talmud Torah Halacha Dal. He's not talking about the mitzvah of tzedakah.
But why can't we say that in other words, if the son is more capable than the father, then the son should take kedima. They both have an obligation to learn Torah Shabbal Peh. And if there's a choice, the son is more capable, then the son should take precedence. And what happened here is that the father thought that the son was a mutzlach, was somebody who could handle the thing, and he went, and he wasn't able to do it.
Right, and he was
So he came
disappointed.
back and he said, "Listen, if you can't do it, then I'm going to go because I'll be more successful than you."
So, Bobby, let me try to formulate an idea, and I think it's what you're saying. In Hilchas Talmud Torah, the goal is to maximize Torah study. What do I mean? The purpose of Torah study is not just to master the material, to understand the Torah, that's for sure what we're dealing with, but to guarantee that that Torah will be passed on and transmitted to next generations. And that obligation is inherent in the Torah itself. Let's call it, if we want to try to use brisket jargon, we'll call it the cheft of the Torah. The cheft of the Torah has to be expanded. It has to be maximized. And now the question is, how do we get to the point where we could maximize Torah study in a way that it'll be passed on as a legacy to the next generation? So the father's obligation vis-a-vis his son ultimately is to expand Torah knowledge and transmit the Torah to his son, almanas, so that his son could now transmit the Torah to the next generation. If the father sees that the son is superior, his capacity, the son's capacity to pass on the Torah is superior, is greater than, supersedes the father's capacity, then his obligation is vis-a-vis the Torah. To pass on the Torah to his son, and if that means that, therefore, ipso facto, the father has to give up his own Torah for the sake of the ultimate benefit or expansion of Torah, that's what he has to do. Is that what more or less you meant, Bobby? I mean, yeah. So in the pages that I gave you, and I want to again thank David for sending them around, that's what I suggested, but I'm still not satisfied. Because I believe that unless we could ground it in the father's obligation vis-a-vis his son, then we're in deep trouble. Because then the issue is not your son. The issue is how to expand Torah. So if, let's say, your friend's son has a greater capacity to study, understand, and transmit Torah than your son, and certainly more than you do have, the father, then maybe we should say that that's also a din of kedima. If it's a kedima vis-a-vis the Torah, then why does that obligation fall on the father vis-a-vis his son rather than on the father vis-a-vis, like, let's say you have a son who's an absolute genius, right? He has the capacity of being the next Gadol Hador, and there's no one around to support him. Meaning, what I see here is something that's grounded in Hilchas Talmud Torah, but it's grounded in the specific, exclusive obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son. So it's not just enough to say that the cheft of the Torah has to be expanded. It's not sufficient to say, well, this boy, my son, has a great future, a glorious career in transmission of Torah. That's not enough. At the end of the day, you have to say that you as a father have that obligation to see to it that your son expands his Torah knowledge which means in this context, Torah Sheba'al Peh, so that your son could pass that on to the next generation, that becomes an obligation incumbent on the father, which I don't understand according to the Kesef Mishna. Because the Kesef Mishna says that in Torah Sheba'al Peh, there is no special obligation on the father. If the father happens to be a chacham, he has to teach his son Torah Sheba'al Peh, just like he has to teach any son Torah Sheba'al Peh. And that's why I'm inclined to think that somehow what we're dealing with is the mitzvah of tzedakah and the principle of umibsarcha al tis'alem, which generates a separate chiyuv on the father. But then I have a problem. Why is this halach in Hilchas Talmud Torah? So let me leave you with the following idea that crossed my mind just yesterday. That we say in Yiddish, fresh gebakt. And it's up to you. The ball's in your court. When we say, based on that Tanit Ve'elio, that the mitzvah of tzedakah encompasses not just physical sustenance, but also Torah, what we seem to be saying is that Torah, like food, water, shelter, clothing, is a means to an end, the end being tzedakah. So if you guarantee that so-and-so will study Torah, that's a mitzvah of tzedakah, and your kiyum mitzvah is tzedakah. But what I'd like to suggest is that there's another kiyum of tzedakah, which is called Talmud Torah. So that when you supply someone with Torah knowledge, and that person is a ra'ev l'lachmecha, ein lechem el Torah, you are fulfilling two mitzvahs at the same time. The mitzvah of tzedakah and the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And I think the Rambam is going to classify teaching Torah in two different places. He's going to include it in Hilchas Talmud Torah. Let me start the other way around. He's going to include it in Hilchas Tzedakah, which is called Matnas Aniyim in the Rambam, and as well, he's going to incorporate it into Hilchas Talmud Torah. Whenever the Rambam quotes a mitzvah twice in two different places, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Rambam is telling you that there is a double kiyum in that mitzvah. You are makayim two different mitzvahs. So where does the Rambam tell me that teaching Torah and supplying someone with Torah knowledge is a kiyum of the mitzvah of tzedakah? So once again, if you have these pages, at the very end of these pages, I quote a Rambam in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim, Perek Yud Halacha Tezayin. And the Rambam writes, Hanose mizonos lebanov, which means he supplies food and sustenance to his sons. And by the way, here the word banov means his male sons. Kidei lelamed es hascharim Torah, hareze bechlal tzedakah. So teaching Torah to your son by supporting them, and that's the case of the Rambam, Anosein mizonos lebanov hascharim, hareze bechlal tzedakah. And perhaps the source for this Rambam is the Tanit Ve'elio, pros l'ra'ev lachmach. So now what I have in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim is black and white, explicit. The Rambam is telling you that teaching Torah or facilitating Torah is a kiyum of tzedakah. So I know that Toronto is one of those cities on the face of the globe where you get a knock on the door probably every day, and somebody comes by, probably from Eretz Yisrael, and he's got a kollel and he needs money for the kollel. So you might say, well, why do I have to support your kollel? I have a mitzvah of tzedakah, and tzedakah means food, shelter, and clothing. And your kollel guys have that. They don't need that. Ella, what they want to sit and learn, that's already a different mitzvah. That's a mitzvah of Torah. So that's a mistake. The mitzvah of tzedakah includes supporting Torah. But I want to ask a different question. When you support Torah, is that a mitzvah of Talmud Torah? Meaning, is it possible that by supporting Torah and facilitating someone else's Torah study, that gives you a double kiyum? You fulfill two mitzvahs for the price of one. You get a mitzvah of tzedakah and a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. So that what I'm suggesting is that tzedakah for Torah study is very unique. In the constellation of the mitzvah of tzedakah, it plays a very unique role. Because whereas in the constellation of mitzvah tzedakah, you get only one kiyum, but if your mitzvah of tzedakah is vis-a-vis Torah study, and your tzedakah is by giving someone the ability to study Torah, then in addition to the mitzvah of tzedakah, you now have a kiyum, a separate kiyum of Talmud Torah. And therefore, if that be the case, again, this is just my thoughts, the Rambam will have to codify this mitzvah of tzedakah even in Hilchas Talmud Torah. And he's going to tell you that if the son is capable and his Torah study is superior on a high quality, then the mitzvah of tzedakah will obligate the father to teach his son Torah or send him off to Abaye's yeshiva. And that's a specific, unique obligation on the father because tzedakah applies to b'sarcha al tis'alin. So if you're asking me, why does the Rambam quote this halach in Hilchas Talmud Torah? It belongs in Hilchas tzedakah in Matnas Aniyim. I'm going to tell you, yeah, the Rambam actually quotes it twice. He's got it in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim, and he's telling you that if, as a father, you supply your son with mizonos so that he can learn and study Torah, then you have a mitzvah of tzedakah, and that belongs in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim. The Rambam in Hilchas Talmud Torah is going to reiterate this and requalify it, and he's going to say that not only is there a mitzvah of tzedakah incumbent on the father vis-a-vis his son to guarantee and facilitate the son's Torah study, but in addition to that, there's a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, that when the father fulfills his chiyuv of tzedakah, he also gains an additional kiyuv. He gets more brownie points, so to speak, up in Shamayim for the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And now you'll ask me, but the Kesef Mishna says that the father has no obligation of Talmud Torah, no mitzvah of Talmud Torah vis-a-vis Torah Shemal Peh. But the answer is, he's going to gain the kiyum of Talmud Torah through the mechanism of tzedakah, because tzedakah for Torah study has, in addition to the general kiyum of tzedakah, has a special unique kiyum of Talmud Torah. And if you ask me, well, is there a unique mitzvah of tzedakah with regard to Talmud Torah that obligates the father to teach his son Torah as tzedakah with a kiyum of Talmud Torah? I would say bedafka Torah Shemal Peh. Because within the context of tzedakah, if you want to claim, well, I'm the father, I also want to sit and learn. I also want to achieve Talmud Torah. But now I'm going to say the following. It's 2 against 1. What do I mean 2 against 1? From the perspective of Talmud Torah, your son is superior to you. His ability and capacity in Torah supersedes yours. That itself might not be enough. But if we add to the picture the mitzvah of tzedakah, then we could tip the scale in favor of the son. Because now you have a double mitzvah. You have not only Talmud Torah, which you might claim, well, my Torah is no less important than his, but in addition, you have his superior Torah. That's worth a couple of brownie points. And then on top of that, you have a mitzvah of tzedakah, altis alim, and we've already seen in the Rambam Matnas Haniyim that by teaching your son Torah, you fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah. So now you have two for the price of one. You have the kiyum of Talmud Torah and a kiyum of tzedakah. Whereas if you would study Torah yourself, you only have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And not only that, your mitzvah of Talmud Torah falls shy of the Talmud Torah of your son because he's Navonu Maskil, he's Mechuded Shmaitata. But if he's not Mechuded Shmaitata, he comes back during Ben Ismaim. And guess what? He doesn't know, he's not sharp, he's not on top of the material. Then your Talmud Torah will tip the scale even though there's a mitzvah of tzedakah. Okay, Rabbosai, this is where we'll stop for today. I'm just sharing with you my musings of hopefully not a madman, but something food for thought. Okay, then. All right. Thank you so much. A lot to think about.